The raiders tore through Dry Creek like a swarm of locusts, and Thomas Blake stood alone, rifle in hand, ready to die defending a town that had already buried too much. Just when the world seemed ready to swallow him whole, a lone figure charged out of the smoke. Rachel Monroe, a rifle strapped to her back, fire blazing in her eyes. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to fight. But when she did, even the battle-hardened men froze to watch. And what happened next would shatter everything they thought they knew about strength, loyalty, and love. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The sun hung low over Dry Creek, a flattened disk of fire dripping behind the jagged ridges that framed the town. Heat still pulsed off the hard-packed earth, and a haze of dust shimmered in the air like a restless spirit. The stagecoach rumbled into the main street with a sound like distant thunder, each wheel striking the ruts with a jarring crack. Rachel Monroe sat stiff-backed inside, one hand gripping the worn handle of her battered suitcase, the other pressed against the pocket of her simple brown dress where the crumpled newspaper ad lay hidden, the ink faded but the promise too loud to ignore. Seeking wife, docile nature, practical skills essential, no foolishness. As the coach jolted to a halt, she exhaled slowly through her nose. She knew this was no place for foolishness, but neither was it a place for weakness. She brushed dust from her skirt, pulled her shoulders square, and stepped down into the open, her boots crunching against the dry, splintering boards of the station platform. The silence that greeted her arrival was thick, almost expectant. From the saloon porch across the street, a few men leaned lazily against posts, chewing on toothpicks and watching with the idle cruelty of bored predators. Their narrowed eyes followed her movements, judging, measuring. A dog barked somewhere behind the general store, and the sound rang sharp against the heavy quiet. At the far end of the street, near the post, he stood. Thomas Blake. Rachel recognized him instantly, tall, weathered, all sharp angles and blunt strength, a man molded by land and labor. His hat shaded his face, but she could feel the weight of his stare even from a distance. Arms crossed over his chest, boots planted wide apart. A silent wall of disapproval. Her heart quickened. "Don't falter," she told herself. "You survived worse than a man's disappointment." Clutching her suitcase tighter, she crossed the street toward him. Each step was a battle against the whispering wind and the louder whispering in her mind. Be enough. Just this once. Be enough. As she neared, Thomas's mouth tightened into a line so thin it could have split granite. He took her in with a glance. Boots scuffed from long travel, hands rough and sunburned, eyes steady but shadowed by too many years of fighting her own battles. "You were supposed to be," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant, but sharpened by the judgment it carried. "Different." The words were not a question. They were a verdict. Around them, the handful of townsfolk who had gathered to witness the spectacle let out muted chuckles and elbowed one another knowingly. Rachel's throat tightened. She straightened her back, forcing herself to meet his eyes without flinching. "You mean Meek?" she said evenly, a blade of defiance hidden in the softness of her tone. Thomas's gaze hardened. There was no warmth there, only calculation. "I need a wife," he said. Each word dropped like a stone. "Not a fighter." For a breath, the world shrank to the space between them, the burning ground, the thick, unbreathable air, the raw, bleeding hope that had carried her across hundreds of miles collapsing under the weight of rejection. The laughter from the porch drifted louder now, emboldened by the silence. Rachel's fingers, roughened by years of work on the frontier, dug into the leather of her suitcase until she could feel the old scars split anew under the strain. Her jaw ached with the effort to hold her head high, to keep the humiliation from spilling out across her face for all to see. Inside her chest, two forces warred, pride and desperation. Pride demanded she turn on her heel, leave without a backward glance. But desperation, old and hungry, whispered of nights spent cold and alone, of broken promises and dwindling chances. She had risked everything on this hope. Everything. Thomas shifted his weight slightly, a movement that carried more dismissal than words ever could. He was already turning away from her, not just physically, but utterly, as if she had been measured, found lacking, and filed away as a mistake. Rachel's body moved before her mind could catch up. She set her suitcase down carefully at her feet, the thud louder than the laughter that now sputtered and grew from the crowd. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the advertisement. Holding it up between two fingers, she let the page flutter mockingly in the warm wind for a heartbeat before releasing it. The ad tumbled down the street like a dead leaf, spinning into the dust. "I answered exactly what you asked for," she said, voice low but cutting, the hurt sharpened into something dangerous. "Maybe you should have been clearer about what kind of woman you wanted." For a moment, only a moment, Thomas hesitated. His eyes flickered, not with guilt, but with something closer to discomfort. A man not used to being challenged. A man who believed control was his birthright. The crowd had grown by then. The blacksmith wiping his hands on his apron, the school teacher with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, old Mrs. Cartwright peering from behind her store window. All of them watching the drama unfold, all of them silently choosing sides. Rachel felt their judgment battering her from every angle, a cruel, invisible assault. Not wanted, not needed, not good enough. Without another word, she bent, picked up her suitcase, and turned away. The heat of humiliation stained her neck and ears. Each step away from Thomas was an act of defiance, but also of grief. Behind her, the snickering rose like a hive of insects, buzzing louder with every heartbeat. But Rachel didn't break into a run. She walked, slow and steady, forcing each step to obey her will. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. As she reached the edge of the platform, she allowed herself a brief glance back, not at Thomas, but at the town itself. Dry Creek sprawled before her like a challenge. Worn buildings leaning in the relentless sun, crooked fences, tired people with eyes too quick to judge. This town thinks it has broken me already. She set her jaw. Let them think it. The battered suitcase bumped against her calf with each stride as she disappeared down the side street, seeking shelter for the night, and perhaps a reason to believe there was still something here worth fighting for. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the weight of rejection, a spark stirred. It would not die easily. It never had. The back room of Mrs. Cartwright's storehouse smelled of dried apples, old hay, and loneliness. Rachel slept there, curled atop a narrow cot with a threadbare blanket, her suitcase tucked beneath for fear that the town's meanness might creep in even at night. The single window was cracked and let in more dust than light, but Rachel counted it a blessing. It kept the room honest. Dry Creek had made its judgment swiftly. She was a woman without a man, and worse, without apology. No church bells had rung for her. No Sunday dinners awaited her. She was neither wife nor widow, just something undefined, and people hated what they couldn't name. Each morning before the sun broke the ridge, she swept the tavern floors, scraping dried beer and spittle from the planks while men slumped unconscious over their tables. Midday found her elbow deep in horse dung at the stables, her back aching, the stink clawing at her clothes and skin. The town barely saw her, except when it needed someone to carry what no one else would. She might have disappeared entirely if not for the small, quiet defiance she wore like armor, the tilt of her chin, the way her hands never trembled no matter how sharp the insult. But Dry Creek learned the cost of underestimating Rachel Monroe. It was a hot afternoon when the blacksmith's boy, Caleb, wandered too close to the riverbank and startled a coiled rattlesnake. His scream split the air. Men ran. Women cried out. But Rachel, rag in hand, apron flapping against her legs, sprinted toward the sound. Before fear could freeze her, she grabbed a splintered shovel and brought it down in a single, decisive blow. The snake's body writhed once, then stilled, its fangs still bared in a final snarl. Rachel kicked dust over it and pulled Caleb into her arms, murmuring words she herself had long forgotten how to believe. When a sudden summer storm sent flash floods roaring through the lower pastures, drowning cattle and threatening livelihoods, it was Rachel who mounted the slick-backed horses alongside the men, roping and shouting until the herd was driven to safety. Mud smeared her face, soaked her skirts, but her eyes burned with a fire that refused to dim. The ranchers didn't thank her, but they looked at her differently afterward. Some with grudging respect, others with uneasy awe. The night trouble found the schoolteacher, Miss Eleanor Vance. It found Rachel, too. The saloon doors had barely swung shut behind a trio of drunken ranchers when Rachel, clearing empty glasses from a back table, caught sight of Eleanor struggling against grabbing hands. Without hesitation, Rachel dropped her tray, crossed the room in 4 hard strides, and planted her fist into the nearest man's gut with the precision of someone who had fought for survival before. Another hand grabbed her hair. She bit down on the panic and smashed her elbow into a crooked nose. Blood splattered across the floorboards. It took 4 men to separate the chaos. Rachel stood panting, one eye already swelling, blood dripping from a split knuckle, and the entire tavern staring at her like she was something half wild, half sacred. Behind the tavern windows in the shadowed street, Thomas Blake stood silent. He watched, hands jammed into his pockets, heart thudding in betrayal of his own logic. The woman was a whirlwind, unruly, dangerous, too fierce by half. Too wild, he muttered to no one but himself. Yet the words tasted wrong the moment he spoke them. In the lamplight, he saw something he hadn't expected. A strength so raw it shamed the town's quiet cowardice. A loyalty so fierce it burned hotter than any prairie fire. That night, Mrs. Cartwright found him lingering near her storehouse, a storm of thoughts darkening his brow. "You know, Thomas Blake," she said, her voice dry as the high plains wind, "maybe what you think you want ain't what's going to keep you standing when the hard times come." She wiped her hands on her apron and fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. "You can build a house out of sweet smiles and soft words, but if you want a home that'll stand when the storms hit, you'll need a woman built out of iron and fire." Thomas said nothing. But deep inside, a seed of unease took root. For Rachel Monroe was not meek. She was the storm itself. The scream of splintered wood split the evening air, sharper and more brutal than any gunshot. Rachel Monroe jerked her head up from the stable yard, the heavy bucket of water sloshing over her boots, forgotten. Across the baked dirt of Dry Creek, the first fires bloomed, vivid against the bruised colors of the setting sun. Raiders. The town had whispered about them for weeks. Men driven mad by hunger and failure after the gold camps dried up. Men who had nothing left to lose and no law left to fear. Now they descended on Dry Creek like a pack of starving wolves, their laughter rough and cruel, their rifles glinting under the dying light. Rachel didn't pause to think. She dropped the bucket where it fell, water pooling darkly in the dust. Her hands moved by instinct, snatching the battered rifle from the stable's wall and checking the chamber with swift, sure fingers. She was halfway to the street before she realized she was running. The town was chaos. Horses screamed as they were driven wild, wagons overturned like toys, storefronts cracked and splintered under boots and fists. Women and children bolted for cover, while the men, those few brave or foolish enough, scrambled to defend what little they had. At the edge of it all, like an anchor in a storm, stood Thomas Blake. He was alone, rifle raised, planted before his ranch like a sentry carved from stone. He faced the oncoming wave with grim finality. His hat had been knocked back, revealing eyes darkened not with fear, but with cold, unbending resolve. Rachel's chest tightened at the sight of him, not because he stood alone, but because he had chosen to, because in his mind he needed no one. "Damn your pride, Thomas Blake." She snatched a half-wild mare tied to the livery post, ignoring its startled buck. Swinging herself into the saddle, she barely spared a glance backward before driving the horse toward the ranch house, dirt spraying from the hooves in frantic clumps. The heat from burning buildings pressed against her skin. The sour stink of smoke clogged her lungs. Yet her heart was steady, beating to a single thought. He will not stand alone. She reined in hard beside him. Dust enveloped them like a cloak. Thomas turned, rifle cocked, and froze. Rachel sat tall in the saddle, skirts torn and dirt-streaked, a second rifle slung across her back, a pistol low on her hip. Her hair, usually braided tight, had come loose in wild tendrils around her face. In her eyes blazed a fire as old as the mountains themselves, unyielding, relentless. "This town needs every fighter it can get," she said, voice steady, almost calm. Thomas opened his mouth, but the roar of the raiders swallowed whatever words he might have found. There was no more time for talking. The first wave slammed into them, a thunder of hooves and howls. Bullets sliced the air. Thomas dropped the first man with a clean shot to the chest. Rachel wheeled the mare and fired with deadly precision, her rifle kicking against her bruised shoulder. The ground was churned into mud and blood beneath the horse's hooves. The stink of powder filled the air, acrid and blinding. Rachel fought with every ounce of herself, not with recklessness, but with a brutal clarity. She moved like someone who understood exactly how fragile life was and had no intention of letting it be stolen cheaply. Thomas found himself stealing glances at her between shots. The way she leaned into the rifle's recoil, the way she covered his blind spots without needing to be told. It was more than courage. It was loyalty. A kind of fierce, raw loyalty that shamed the polite, empty promises of softer women. And it rattled him to his core. A raider charged, swinging a club. Rachel spun from the saddle, using the horse as cover, and fired point-blank into the man's thigh. He collapsed with a howl, dropping his weapon in the dirt. Another raider tried to grab her bridle. She kicked him savagely in the knee and pistol-whipped him across the jaw, sending him sprawling. The battle blurred into one long, terrible heartbeat. Gunfire, screams, the metallic tang of blood in the air. Rachel lost count of how many times she reloaded, how many times Thomas's back brushed against hers in a frantic, wordless dance of survival. And still they stood. Still they fought. When the raiders finally broke, broken spirits, broken bodies, they fled into the twilight, leaving behind only wounded horses, burning wagons, and the groaning wreckage of Dry Creek. Silence crashed down, deafening after the storm. Rachel barely noticed. Her limbs were trembling, her breath shallow. She tried to dismount, but her legs gave way before she could swing down. She hit the ground hard on one knee, her rifle clattering from numb fingers. Thomas was beside her in an instant. He dropped to one knee, rough hands catching her under the arms, steadying her as if she were something fragile and precious. For a long moment, he simply held her, his forehead pressing against hers, the heat of his breath mixing with hers in the smoke-choked air. Rachel blinked up at him, too exhausted to speak. Thomas, who had once looked at her and seen only trouble, now saw something altogether different. Something that turned his world inside out. Not weakness, not wildness, but truth. Without hesitation, he lifted her battered hand to his lips. The knuckles were raw, bloodied, skin torn where the rifle strap had bitten deep. He kissed them, softly, reverently, each touch a confession he could no longer withhold. "I was wrong," he whispered against her skin, voice breaking like old wood. "You're everything I need." Rachel didn't answer. She didn't have to. In the spaces between breath and silence, in the way her battered body leaned into his without shame or apology, the answer was already given. They had fought side by side. They had survived together. And something deeper than victory had been won between them, something neither smoke nor blood could take away. The morning of the wedding dawned cold and fierce. The sky stretched taut above Dry Creek like a canvas scrubbed clean by the violence of the night before. Ash still clung to the eaves of buildings, scorched wood yawning in broken door frames. But the air itself was new, sharp, full of the kind of silence that demanded reverence. It was the silence before something sacred. Rachel Monroe rose from the narrow cot in Mrs. Cartwright's storehouse, her body aching from old wounds and the newer ones too fresh to name. She dressed with slow, unhurried motions, pulling the simple blue gown over her bruised skin. The fabric whispered against her ribs, faded and worn soft by time. It wasn't made for her, but somehow it felt like it had waited for her, carrying the memory of hands that had stitched it with care in a world that did not often deal in kindness. Every stitch, every faded thread, told a story Rachel understood intimately. Survival, grief, stubborn hope. She ran her palms down the seams, smoothing them with the same tenderness she reserved for broken horses and frightened children. There was no veil, no jewels, no perfumes to hide the raw honesty of her presence. She tied her hair back with a scrap of ribbon, the ends fraying like the edges of old dreams. The cracked mirror showed her what the town would see, not a blushing bride, but a woman carved by storms. Her hands bore the map of labor, her face the marks of battle. A fresh bruise bloomed on her cheekbone where the butt of a raider's rifle had kissed her skin. But her eyes, God help her, her eyes burned with something undimmed, something the world had tried and failed to put out. At the far end of town, Thomas Blake stood before the general store, adjusting the brim of his only good hat. His boots, polished but still scarred from years of use, planted firm in the dirt as if to declare, "Here I am." His shirt, stiff with starch, strained slightly across his broad shoulders. He did not fidget, did not glance around to seek approval. He stood still, the way mountains did, silent, certain. Slowly, the town gathered. First, Mrs. Cartwright, clutching a Bible worn soft from years of grief and hope. Then the blacksmith and his boy, shirts tucked and hair combed. Then Eleanor Vance, the schoolteacher Rachel had defended with her fists. Even the sheriff emerged, dusting off a badge dulled from long disuse, as if today demanded he remember what justice was supposed to look like. They came not for spectacle. They came because survival had cost them too much to squander the rare sight of a vow made not from convenience, but from defiant, battered love. They came because they needed to believe in something stronger than fear. Rachel crossed the square barefoot, dust puffing up around her steps, her worn boots tied together and slung over one shoulder, a symbol, perhaps, that she needed no armor between herself and this moment. Every eye turned to her, but she felt no shame, only gravity, as if the world itself tilted toward this choice. At the center of it all, Rachel met Thomas's gaze, and the world narrowed into a single thread between them, spun from every blow they had withstood, every step they had fought to take alone, now converging into something neither would ever walk away from again. No grand speeches passed between them, No soaring promises, just two battered souls standing naked before each other, unhidden, unafraid. "I do," Rachel said, her voice carrying across the square like the first clean break of spring ice. "I do," Thomas answered, his throat roughened by more than dust. When their hands met, the calluses scraped skin, and it was perfect. The honesty of it, the certainty. No gold ring could have forged a stronger bond than the clasp of their work-worn fingers. The town erupted into rough, joyous noise, boots stomping, hats tossed skyward, a few tears hastily wiped from weathered faces. Mrs. Cartwright sobbed openly into her apron. Caleb hollered loud enough to scare the horses. The sheriff tipped his hat in solemn acknowledgement of a kind of courage that badges could never grant. But Rachel and Thomas heard none of it. Their world was a small, fierce thing now, a hearth built in the middle of a cold, wide desert. That night, after the sky darkened into a river of stars, they sat side by side on the porch of the modest ranch house Thomas had built with his own hands, boards hammered in with sweat and silent prayers. The night air smelled of wood smoke, earth, and the distant, clean promise of rain. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his hand brushing against Rachel's. Not an accident, but a deliberate act, a question whispered through touch. His thumb found hers, rough meeting rough, and stayed there. He turned his head, eyes shadowed but bright with reflection. "I thought I needed a lamb," he said, voice so low the crickets nearly swallowed it. "Turns out," he paused, voice thick, "I needed a lioness." Rachel turned slowly, the stars catching in her hair. Her smile, faint, aching, triumphant, was a scar made holy. She said nothing, because words were too thin to carry what lived inside her chest. She reached for his hand fully this time, wrapping her fingers around his. No hesitation, no second guessing. She was not half a woman seeking rescue, nor was he half a man in search of salvation. They were whole, wounded and defiant and fiercely, miraculously whole, and for the first time in their lives, they did not feel alone. Because love, the real kind, does not arrive dressed in silk and soft hands. It rides in battered boots, fists bruised, heart bleeding and unbowed. It stands its ground. It roars back against the dark. And in the brittle silence of Dry Creek, under a sky bigger than all their pasts combined, two stubborn souls carved out something that would not break, no matter how hard the world tried. And Dry Creek, battered, scorched, but unyielding, healed a little more that night too,